We are doing 2 videos in one day. I don't care if you notice I'm wearing the same clothes and the same hair. Doesn't matter to me. We're going to do the rest of viruses. Hold tight. Let's get over here. I want to present. Here we go. We stopped last time talking about parts of a virus. Then it was the end for the day. And we're going to jump in here with some life cycle. All right, I'm going to make my bubble small. So people catch viruses from living things like animals and each other. Certain viruses have the ability to what we call spill over, where they go from an animal to a person. Maybe the person ate the animal or came into contact with its bodily fluids and didn't wash their hands before getting in their mouth, their nose, or their eyes. When that happens, like I said, that's called spillover. Animals can transmit viruses between themselves. People transmit viruses between themselves as well. Remember that viruses must have a living host or else they cannot survive for very long. Viruses can survive on surfaces for a certain amount of time, depending on environmental conditions, depending on the type of surface you're talking about. So that's all variable. However, after that period of time, the virus starts to break down and it also can't reproduce unless it's in a host. So what we're going to look at here is the way that they, why won't this go? There we go. Is the way that they reproduce inside of a host cell. Okay, so what we're looking at here, like we've shown before, is a little virus called a bacteriophage. These only infect bacterial cells. I actually think they're pretty cute. They look like little aliens. So the virus contains its own viral DNA. The base plate attaches to the host cell. And like we talked about, that sheath is going to squeeze together and inject the DNA inside. Okay, so we're looking at, in part A, we've got our host cell's DNA, the virus has its DNA, and obviously the virus. That sheath is going to squeeze that DNA from the virus inside of the host DNA. It has special pieces and parts to it that can break open the host cell's DNA and insert its own DNA into the genome of that bacteria. Once that set of DNA, that set of genes is inserted into the bacteria's DNA, bacteria have a ring of DNA called a plasmid, if you remember from before. That plasmid has a special job in the bacteria of producing certain parts for it, doing certain jobs. It has genetic material that it makes certain parts for the bacteria. However, when that virus inserts its DNA into that plasmid, now the bacteria is reading this code, reading this blueprint. It's just kind of filtering it through like it's reading a book, but in a circle, and it's creating parts. It's creating parts and more parts and more parts and more parts. And if you look at figure C here, you've got virus DNA replicates, and it also is building virus pieces and parts. You can see that it's got all the little parts now of a bacteriophage. It just doesn't have the DNA inside the bacteriophage yet. In section D, these little viruses have completely taken over the bacterial cell. That bacteria is not doing anything other than producing more virus pieces. Okay, it is essentially just a factory for bacterial viruses, or bacteria attacking viruses in this case. The very last stage of this whole replication process is the complete destruction of the bacteria cell. If this was a virus that infects human cells, the same thing happens. Okay, so it gets inside the human cell or the animal cell. It replicates inside that, okay, by injecting its DNA into the host cell's DNA. So now the host cell is producing virus parts. Those parts are assembled and then they burst out of the host cell, killing that cell, which then makes people feel sick. It kills this sad little bacteria, or it makes any organism sick that happens to be infected with that virus. Now you've got millions of virus particles just erupting out of this cell, and they're going on to each infect their own cell. Okay, each one finds a host, they infect that host cell, and then they do this same process all over again. Just inserting their DNA in, replicating pieces and parts, building new viruses, and then exploding out into the environment, whatever that environment happens to be, an animal body, a human body, anything. The life cycle continues on until something gets into its way. Maybe you've got medication, maybe you've got a fever. We're going to do the immune system, and fevers help to knock out viruses by increasing the temperature of the surrounding area. This slide here has different types of virus shapes. So the one that we've talked about so far is a bacteriophage. That's a complex shape. Not all viruses look this way. A lot of them tend to look more like the spherical, and others tend to look a lot like the polyhedral. So these are pretty common shapes. There are many, many more shapes than these. These just happen to be the most common, okay? The next couple slides here have some examples. Move my little picture. This is what the polio virus looks like. We have vaccines for polio. Most of us get vaccinated against polio when we're itty bitty babies. And this disease causes muscle and nerve damage. And some people end up in a wheelchair. Some people end up unable to breathe on their own. This is such a wild disease that just slowly breaks your body down. Chickenpox virus, I actually had chickenpox as a kid. And that's one of those diseases they tell you can only get once. It causes little scabs, little itchy scabs on the skin that eventually just go away. This is Ebola virus. That's a filovirus. I've read some books and watched some documentaries on Ebola virus. That one is pretty fascinating. That causes a high fever, and then it causes severe, and I mean severe, internal bleeding. And that's usually what kills the victim of Ebola virus. This, everybody knows what this picture is. We've all seen this one all over every news site, but this is what the coronavirus looks like. It is called coronavirus because the surface glycoproteins here, these act like little chemical flags, okay, that tell the host cell, I'm safe, let me in. And then they get in, and then they destroy everything. The reason it's called corona is because these glycoproteins look like a crown, and corona means crown. Over here in the bottom right, we've got the influenza virus. We know that one causes all different types of flu. There's lots of different types of influenza. So if you remember back to my last lecture where we talked about DNA versus RNA, influenza virus is an RNA virus. So it mutates very quickly. Pretty much every time it replicates, it mutates a very tiny bit. So from year to year, that little tiny bit of mutation has happened millions of times. And so it ends up to be a very different, genetically different virus than it was the year before. We have vaccines for influenza. They usually just use kind of like hospital care for Ebola. They may have a vaccine for Ebola by now. There is a chickenpox vaccine. There is a polio vaccine. Coronavirus is obviously way too new for any sort of vaccine and or medication to help with that. Up on the upper left here, this is what a bacteriophage looks like. This is a scanning electron microscope image that has not been colored. I don't know what color they actually are, but they're so tiny and I think they look like little aliens. In the middle here, this is HIV. The yellow part is HIV. That is the human immunodeficiency virus that causes your immune system to kind of stop working properly and attack itself. And it can lead to AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, where your immune system pretty much doesn't work anymore. And you can get sick with anything and become very, very ill from something that is usually minor. There is no vaccine against HIV, but there are medications people take if they have contracted it to not pass it on to anybody else. Up here, the blue is a measles virus. Measles has a vaccine also. That is one people typically get as babies. This virus doesn't cause too big of an actual infection. Some people do die from it. It's not super common for people to die from it, but one of the most interesting things about measles virus is that it wipes out your body's memory for all other diseases you've gotten. So if you got all your shots except measles, okay, and you catch measles, your body forgets that it had any other disease, and it leaves you open and susceptible to catching things that you've already built up resistance or immunity to. it kind of wipes out your body's immunity memory, which is so crazy. It can exist in the environment for a long time too. That's an interesting one. Down here in the lower left, these little blue strings are kind of related to Ebola. This is the Marburg virus. It also causes that really super scary internal bleeding and a fever. That's one of the world's most deadly viruses. That and Ebola and HIV, I think, are up there for some of the world's most deadly viruses. They have up to a 90% death rate if that virus is contracted. Down here in the lower right, this is rabies. This disease often is transferred between animals to people. This is a perfect example of spillover. People talk about don't come into contact with wild animals, or don't handle raccoons or anything like that. They can transmit rabies virus in the saliva. So their saliva has to get into your body, either into your mouth or through a cut in your skin. This virus causes neurological damage, very, very severe neurological damage, and eventual death. It's one of those ones that if you catch it, you do not survive it. So people who do come into contact with those types of animals, like raccoons or bats, are encouraged to seek medical attention, even if they weren't bitten, but if they have physical contact, because it's that scary. I rescued a bat once. Found him in my yard, just kind of squeaking on the ground. So I used a bucket and I scooped him up, not touching him, into the bucket and took him to a wildlife sanctuary. And they asked me specifically if I had touched it. And I said no, because they can carry it. It's not very common in this area, thankfully, but they have the capability to carry the rabies virus. So they're like, please sign this paper. Make sure you don't touch it. And I didn't. Another fun fact, because I love fun facts, a lot of people think that they can catch rabies from possums. Possums are found all over the place. They love to play dead if they're scared. And to further enhance that feeling of looking dead, they start to smell really bad and they drool. One of the symptoms of rabies infection is excessive frothy drooling. And so possums have kind of gotten this horrible reputation of, they cannot carry the rabies virus. Their body temperature, I think it is too warm or too cold to support the rabies virus. So they can't pass it on. And that's pretty cool. Possums are awesome. In the end, wash your hands, you filthy animals. And if you are interested in learning any other information about infectious diseases, my favorite podcast is called This Podcast Will Kill You. Each episode is a different infectious disease, and the hosts are two doctors, one of them a medical doctor, one a PhD, that have spent their graduate work studying infectious diseases. They're both epidemiologists. They are incredibly smart. They talk to experts. They hold excellent interviews, and they teach all about many different types of infectious diseases. So if that is, my earring, if that's something you're interested in, check that out. Other than that, if you've got any questions for me, feel free to send me an email, leave a comment in the bird. Leave me a comment somewhere in your classroom, and I will get back to you very, very shortly. See ya.